Our plugin of the week for mixing with Mike is the NLS by Waves. NLS stands for Nonlinear Summer and our nonlinear summing. And the whole concept of this is something that engineers have attached to and became like a big thing in the late 90s and early 2000s, where in working with digital, many engineers felt like they were missing some of the analogness of what they were doing. And so at that point, what people were doing is they were accumulating things like Neve EQs and compressors and things like that. And they would have tube mics and the tube mic pre's and all that sort of stuff. But when you work with those components, it's not the full sound of the console. So in other words, if you had a 1073 EQ, it would only be maybe 40% of the sound of the Neve console that it would be fitted in. Because when you were going through that console, not only would you be going through the preamp and the actual equalization, but you would be going through a lot of other summing technology along the way, right? So you'd be going through other transformers and faders and capacitors and whatever other components that were used to combine all those audio signals together. And that's where the summing aspect comes in. So the idea of summing is that if you take a whole series of voltages that would be different audio signals, you would be combining them together into a mono or stereo signal, right? So that's what a bus would be, or that would what summing would be. So you would be combining all these signals. So the whole idea of having a fader and having a pan pot is you're taking a mono or stereo signal and you're summing it in with a bunch of other signals physically, right, as voltage, adding those voltages in with other voltages. And those voltages will create certain cancellations and additions at different frequencies when those instruments blend together. And how those signals are blended together is the actual summing technology. Now, there is some of the stuff that happens within the channel, the actual physical channel, before it gets actually to the stereo output. And then you have the stereo sum, right, which is all the signals going to stereo. So there's certain things or stages in the process of all the big analog consoles that would happen on a channel by channel basis and then in a global stereo basis, if that makes sense. So, and there are many summing amps that happen. I mean, basically an analog console more or less is just a big summing amp. You're just taking signals and you're combining them together through a send, so they can be fed, the mix of that can be fed into a reverb or a delay, right? And then you also taking all these faders and you're feeding them into buses. So those buses can be fed to and recorded onto a tape machine or recorded into a Pro Tools, right? So those individual buses would be a digital signal that would be fed into an A to D converter. And then you would also have audio signals that would be mixed or blended together into a stereo mix so that you could feed them to the speakers. Okay, so all of this technology is sort of that missing piece, right, in the puzzle for all these things. So what Waves did is they went about the process of emulating three basic consoles, and they don't give you the specific names, but what they've done is they've created three consoles, which is an SSL console, so the summing technology of a G series console, the summing technology of an EMI console, and the summing technology of a Neve console. And so this was Mike Spike Dent's or Stent's console. There was Mike, I'm sorry, I forget his name, who has an EMI console, actually famous engineer, and Nevo. So these are the different, these are three different people who have come in. Now, what's really cool is that they did the channel, right? So there's a channel version, NLS channel, and an NLS bus, which is the stereo bus. And I'll get to the mixer in a second because this is where it gets kind of interesting. So each one has the summing technology of those things. What's really cool about the channel version, though, is that when you actually create a channel version here, right, you could see actually just kind of going through. I'll just kind of, hold on 1 second here, kind of go back out here for a second, go back to this. And what you'll see with the different consoles is that they didn't just do like one channel strip and emulate it. They actually took and they did 32 from each console, which means that each channel would sound different. So if you had audio signals coming off, then each NLS channel would be different. So if I now call up NLS, the second instantiation that I did here would actually be channel 2, right? So this is if this was spike number 1, right? Which is what the original was here, was spike number 1. That would be spike number 2, channel strip 2. This would be spike number 3, channel 3, channel 4. So what it has is you have like a slightly varied coloration of 32 different channels, right? And so, yes, and that EMI console is the EMI TG12345, which is kind of interesting. It's like, let's come up with a number for this. 12345. That sounds good. Let's go. Probably one of those things where we need to come up with a number before we go to the bar to tip back some ales, and that's kind of what happened. So it got that on the on the line here. So that's perfect. So anyway, when you go through this though, they actually have the noise. You can actually have the harmonic distortion characteristic or the noise added in. You could bypass it, and you could also overdrive the input. So this would be emulating the microphone input. So you're driving a line level signal into it. They also have the ability, like a harmonic distortion characteristic, where you can drive the input signal higher. So as you're bringing an audio signal in, you could actually make it punch more, right? So I'm not sure if we have any drums here. Right, so here, so this would be overdriving the input. And if I brought it into, this would be like bringing that line level signal into a mic input, right? So this is kind of the basic So in addition to more gain is adding like a harmonic distortion, sort of somewhat compression characteristic by overdriving it. And that's what's kind of cool. And you could bypass that and that works. So you have this on a channel by channel basis that you can overdrive. And then if you're running it into a stereo channel, what you can do is you can actually make it so that it is a true stereo or dual mono, meaning that it gets like either two separate, so the left and right are slightly varied, or they're identical to each other, which is really cool. So you can kind of get like that basic, that basic way of working with it. So hold on, there's a question here about it, which is coming from the line here, which is that the more that you drive, the level will be brought down. Is that the idea? Or just wondering what practices were you? Well, in this case, overdriving was not necessarily, it was something that just sort of happened. Not like it just sort of happened, but you would have like a gain control, whether it was at the line stage or the mic stage coming in, where you would decide like how much you want it, what level you would want to bring it into the channel. And most part, you would kind of work on a unity gain principle. Most of the time, you would just be you would get some kind of natural harmonic distortion just coming through the console, and you just would allow that to be. And then occasionally you would pick your spots where you would overdrive the input a little bit or drive the input a little bit more to get it to distort a little bit more, and then you would adjust the gain at some other place. So if that was at the line input stage, sort of like what I was doing here by doing the drive, I would be driving more signal in and therefore adding some distortion with the signal coming in and then making up for the output level at the fader, which is what you see here. So that's the basic idea, right, of what was going on. And that's how you would do this. So in other words, if you were just putting this in like this, you probably wouldn't just sit with the extra gain. You would make up for it. And they kind of did it in a way where it doesn't really add as much gain as it's not adding like 8 dB of gain. That's what the number is. And I hope that answers the question. Yeah, so that's the basic idea. Now, you could also do this at the bus end, right? So on the bus side of things, this would be on the stereo bus. Right, so I could also overdrive this here. So what's really cool is that if I actually call up all of my my NLS channels here, what I can do is I can assign them to VCA groups. And so, well, what does that mean when I assign it to a VCA group? This is like a virtual group. Like, so on consoles, what you would have is you could assign individual channels to a group, and this would give you the control from one fader. Now, what's weird is that this is sort of like a virtual console, but what it allows me to do is it allows me to set all of those channels to be an SSL, an EMI console, or to a Neve console, and I could do so globally. So if I assign all these to group number 1, this gives me the ability to assign my channels globally, right? I can drive them globally, right? Even though it doesn't affect the settings that you see right here. So I could do it individually, and then I could do a global drive. I'd have a trim control, which would be trimming all of these individually, virtually. I could take the noise in and out, right? So you could see here there are certain features that are grayed out now, right? Because they are released to the global control. And so this panel here gives me 8 different faders, and I can name them. So if these are my drums, then I could call these my drums and give that a name. Now, what's really cool is like if I did this and say I did drums, guitars, etc., I can open up this panel from any channel, right? So here I have the identical thing. From any of these, I can open up just by clicking on this. And if I make changes on one, you see that it happens on both. So this is not like there's a separate mixer here and a separate mixer here. There's one virtual mixer that you can access from any of the plugins by clicking on it, which is kind of cool. So I can drive it from here. And what this does is it's sort of like the basic idea is I want to take my whole mix and I want to run it through a Neve console, or I want to run it through an SSL, or I want to run it through an EMI console. That's the basic idea. So you could take this and you could apply it to all the channels, right, of your audio tracks, and as the NLS channel, and then on the mix bus, put the NLS bus, and then that would give you the bus output technology end of the console, if that makes sense. And then what you're really doing is you're taking your whole mix and you're running, you're Nevifying it, or EMIifying, or SSLifying it, that kind of thing. And this is all the sticky, gooey in-between stuff, not the compression, not the equalization, not all the sends and all the other things that go on. It's all the gooey in-between components that affect the quality of the sound of the signal, right? And that's the basic idea of the NLS, right? Is that it's meant to sort of give you this capability of running your mix through a big analog desk. That's the basic idea. So the question then becomes, where do you place it, okay, in the signal flow? So usually what they recommend is that you apply this at the first plugin slot. And what you do is you take and you just say, okay, let me just put this globally across the whole thing, my whole mix to all my audio tracks, and then you could assign them to different VCA groups, and then you could put your drums through a Neve console. You could put your guitars through an SSL console. You could put your vocals through the EMI console, or any combination of all of those. So you're getting the best of all worlds and the ability to mix them up for whatever works. And then, but you could sort of decide globally where you want everybody to sit, what console you want to run them through, and then do the rest of your mixing accordingly. And that's one way to do it. I have a tendency not to like to work that way because what I think it does is it makes you not work as hard. My theory is that I think it's better placed at the last plugin slot. So after you've done all of your other processing and all your work, I save this for the last stage after all my processing. And then I run it through. And then what I really get is now if I run this through and now all of a sudden it's run through a Neve or an EMI or an SSL, it's taking all the hard work that I've done and it's like really honing and focusing it in and making it just really super special. Whereas I find that if you start off with the plugin first, the tendency is to not work as hard on your mix. And then you don't end up getting as good of a result. That's what I have found. So my tendency is to place it more towards the end stages, right? And if you were doing it sort of in the way that they prescribe, because these components for the channel are not just emulating the input, but also the output technology of each channel. And then you got the mix bus stuff. With the mix bus stuff, if you were doing a tape emulation, and you were doing this the correct way, the first plugin you would put would be tape emulation plugins, then the NLS running it into the console, and now then you would do all your processing. That would be like one way if you were trying to keep it as true as possible. And then when you got to the mix bus, you would put the NLS bus and then going into a tape emulation plugin like you were printing it to an analog tape machine, right? And then that would be like the full method for running a console. Now, it's also going to eat up a lot of CPU cycles, right? So it's going to eat up some plug-in processing power. So if you don't have a really strong computer for this, you might be a little bit more limited in how often or how many of these that you kind of put on. Or you start to take your prior plugins like your subtractive EQ and some of that other stuff, and you start to burn those or freeze those into the audio files, right? Burn them as audio so you can take that processing power back and use it for your console juicing, if you will. But that's the basic idea of it. And the thing that's most confusing to people is the mixer. The mixer is not a real true mixer in that the audio signal never passes through here. It's just virtually controlling all the individual members of each particular group, if that makes sense. But the mixer section on each one is the same virtual mixer, whether it's an NLS bus, because this guy can also be, the NLS bus can be assigned to the same group as the channel, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit confusing from that aspect, and you have to think of it slightly in a different way from the way that you would normally think about it, right? From the way that a real analog console runs. But that's the basic idea, right? So there is our plugin of the week, the NLS by Waves. Really cool one, and one that's worth adding to your plugin collection.